Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Genesee Spotlights. I'm John Kotarski, your host. This evening, we're going to take a look at the Flint Institute of Arts. You know, when Alex de Tocqueville arrived here in 1831, he was struck by the paradox of the people he found living here. On the one hand, this was a very harsh environment. Swampland, mosquitoes, wild animals. Yet the people he found living here had an uncommon intellectual curiosity. They spoke several European languages and many of the local Indian dialects, drank out of china teacups, and read Milton and Shakespeare. Early Flint had a very progressive reputation. So it's no wonder that a private art school was formed here in the 1920s. And that's where our story begins. On a cold January day in 1927, Frank Stevenson formed the Flint School of Art and Design. He had 8 students. It was located in the center building on the Saginaw Street Bridge. Back then, the bridge had buildings from Water Street north to First Avenue. Frank didn't know it, but an art school was exactly what Flint wanted and needed. It was less than a year before 2 strong-willed women, Mrs. Bruce McDonald and Mrs. Walter Winchester, became convinced that the fledgling art school should be purchased and expanded into a community arts center. And that's just what they did. First, they convinced George Crapo Wilson of the idea, which wasn't hard. He had community spirit in his blood. His grandfather was Henry Crapo, an early Flint pioneer leader, and a lumber baron, and the 15th governor of the state of Michigan. Well, between the 3 of them, they raised $10,000. And on January 28, in 1928, they purchased the Flint School of Art and Design. They asked Ray Strong, who was then head of the art department of the Flint Printing Company, to supervise the students. And before long, there were over 150 enrolled. A public dinner was held at the Dran Hotel, where the main speaker was Dudley Watson from the Chicago Institute of Arts. He stressed the importance of developing the industrial arts, as well as keeping abreast of the trends happening in Europe at the time, and encouraging the creative work of artists we had working right here in our own community. On April 2nd, 1928, it was decided to change the name to the Flint Institute of Arts and rent space here at the Bronson Fisher Building on the 2nd floor. Adrian Dornbush was appointed its first director. He was a protege of Dudley Watson from the Chicago Institute of Arts. And in the winter of that year, a very important event occurred. On February 18th, 1929, Michael A. Gorman was elected to the board of directors of the Flint Institute of Arts. He came to Flint a few months earlier to be editor of the Flint Journal, that prized jewel in the Booth newspaper chain. By 1930, the Institute had outgrown its space and looked for larger quarters. It found it at Rio Salmon's garage that was located here on the corner of First Avenue and Beach Street.
The Rio Salmon's garage building was wonderful. You opened the big 12-panel oak door and walked up, I think, 20-some steps, but at the top of the steps was some beautiful painting, and that was the hallway, you know, and the desk was to the left, and to the left of that was the lithography room, and there was a little storeroom behind the secretary's desk, and further on was the big studio, lighted from the north and from the east. I think the ceiling must have been 10 feet, but it was just wonderful. It smelled great because casein paint at the time, the stuff we used on paper, was called Texelite. It had a beautiful, beautiful aroma. You know, it was a pleasure to walk up to the studio, grab the manila paper, thumbtack it on a board, and go to work. I remember being taken there by my Aunt Mary. And because my mother was busy with other children, and we took the streetcar down, and I was enrolled. And I think it was through the public school program, but this was underwritten, if I am not mistaken, by Mary Bishop. I'm quite certain that she asked around the city for people that might be interested in furthering their artistic studies. It was magic. I wanted to be an artist. I think every kid in the class wanted to be an artist. We didn't know that much. We only knew a few highlights. We knew that Rivera painted some frescoes in Detroit, and that was quite close. I didn't read the newspapers a lot or whatever. I didn't know that he went to New York to paint a big fresco until Bill Croft introduced me to the Dimitrovs, who lived next door to his mother's on Dewey Street. And the creative climate was Thomas Hart Benton is a great painter, John Stewart Curry is a great painter, Grant Wood is stylistically very interesting. We saw lithographs of his. George Gross was a great person. You know, it was, okay, in a word, it was, we're sort of like involved with our immediate environment and people, more than ideas. More than ideas about what is art all about anyway. Brozick was great when we would study old master paintings and would go through composition and how these things held together and what makes a painting, you know, what makes a great work of art. I remember one afternoon just looking at black and white reproductions of frescoes that Orozco did, and how he indicated how the black pattern wove itself so miraculously through these fresco panels, and you know, the directional lines and so on and so forth. And that was the climate. We knew Ed Ferguson existed, Basil Hawkins existed, Bob, there was a Bob someone or other that drew very well, you know, John Davies. We knew about Zoltan Sepeshy. We knew about the Michigan Artist Show that we all tried getting into. And Jacques Lazare did get into it one year when he was, what, 16 or 17 years old. So he was the greatest artist in Flint. You know, that was the climate. What we call the Fine Arts Ball. And yes, we painted decorations for that. The students painted decorations. They were quite huge, 8 feet by 10 feet on paper. They were stretched out on the floor of the Rio Salmon's garage. And, you know, there was an exhibit maybe on the walls, but people had to be very careful because Rudy La Riviera had a big mural on paper he was painting. Bob Calhoun had one, Ed Ferguson had one, maybe Basil Hawkins and Ed Ferguson had one. And these decorations were painted to hang in the ballroom of the Durand Hotel, and it was the Fine Arts Ball. People dressed in costumes, you know. We were invited, can you believe? We were teenagers, but we were invited to the shindig. We didn't participate in any of the fancy dinners or anything, but we arrived on the scene maybe 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, and you know, we were taken downstairs where the little bar was set up, and I think, what did we drink? Lemonade and Coca-Cola? Teenagers, you know, drinking lemonade and Coca-Cola on Bohemian nights. So. And people danced till, what, 2 or 3 in the morning, for heaven's sakes. And then we were driven home. And we were led to believe that this is part of the artist's life, that, you know, he's got to have a blowout every so often. And it's good to get the artist and the patron together and have a party.
In 1941, the Institute wanted its own building, so it purchased the Congregational Church, located on First Street. It's where the Bell Telephone Building is today. It stayed here until 1958. That's when the Institute became involved in an extraordinary experiment. The idea was simple enough. Raise $30 million privately among your friends and build a cultural center that included music, art, history, theater, throw in a planetarium for good measure. The idea was the brainchild of none other than Michael A. Gorman. It was such a grand idea, it needed a small, intimate space to be presented adequately. So a small Cape Cod on Calumet Street that was the home of Mike Gorman was it. It became affectionately known as the Club Calumet.
Good evening. You're in for a real treat tonight. We're in the Club Calumet, Mike Gorman's fanciful club where he and people of the 40s and the 50s in Flint laid the plans which formed the basis for Flint's College and Cultural Center. At these chairs and being served from this bar were quite likely to have been people like Dr. Fleming Barber, C.S. Mott, Mike Gorman, and the others that were around in Flint. Now, over here, on these very benches, it's quite possible that you might have seen C.S. Mott or Tony DiLorenzo laying the plans, doing the kinds of things, hatching the plots, as it were, almost, that eventually came into being as Flint's College and Cultural Center, and the $30 million, more importantly, the $30 million that it took to get us going. One of the individuals who visited the Club Calumet in those years is here tonight, Dr. Fleming Barber. Let's go over and talk to him for a few minutes. Dr. Barber, we're sitting here in the Club Calumet in this little intimate setting that you remember. You were here and on a few occasions, weren't you, or several occasions?
This is one of the great experiences in Flint to be invited to Club Calumet.
Exclusive kind of an?
Well, in a way, it sort of recognized the fact maybe you'd done something, or maybe Mike hoped you could do something. But Mike had something in mind. Anybody he ever invited here,
It just didn't happen by chance.
just didn't drop off the street and say, "I'd like to come in and see your club, Mike."
I see. When did they usually meet here at the club? What were the
Well,
occasions?
Mike would have special dinners here or special meetings, but generally speaking, most of us came in after a United Way meeting, a Red Feather meeting, maybe a hospital board meeting or something Mike had in mind for the community. That was the time when he socialized and pumped you for ideas and told you what he thought should be done.
What was the Club Calumet? How would you describe it?
Well, it was a little house on Calumet Avenue in Flint, and I lived around the corner from there on Blanchard Street. And we got together there frequently, and it was kind of a mecca for influential people in Flint to come to Mike Gorman's Club Calumet for a drink or a visit or lunch or Sunday lunch or brunch, whatever. And he had some very interesting guests, dean of the medical school of the University of Michigan, governors. I met Admiral Hart there during World War II, who was in charge of our Pacific forces. Just a very influential group of people. And people like Charles Stewart Mott and Bob Longway and Dutch Bauer and all the Flint people would assemble there.
How did you get an invitation to how would one gone about getting an invitation to the Club Calumet?
Well, I don't know that you'd ever be able to persuade anybody to invite you, but you had to be invited by Mike or his secretary. She would call and say there'd be a gathering and that Mr. Gorman would very much like to have you there. So you went.
Hardly dare refuse command performance?
It was a command performance, yes. But it was a very stimulating experience, so you always went. Always look forward to the invitation.
What went on in one of the club meetings? What's likely to...
Well, you usually had a drink and some light food and had a lot of good conversations. And I think really it was all designed to improve the quality of life in Flint. It was to persuade people to become more civic-minded, to be more generous, to help the community fund, the College and Cultural Center, and all that type of activity. Because Mike Gorman only had one objective in mind, to make Flint a better place in which to live. And anything having to do with Flint or anyone who would support Flint, like General Motors, you were invited.
Being a student at Cranbrook, and my studio was on the second floor, and it was very interesting to see Mike Gorman walking, shoulder to shoulder with Zoltan Sepeshi up and down Academy Row, and I'm saying to myself, well, isn't this something? Here, the editor of our local newspaper is here talking to Zoltan Sepeshi, so all these things I am hearing about Mike Gorman being quite a great man are absolutely true. I was quite pleased to think that he came from Flint. I thought I was in awe of him, truthfully, even to the very end. He, I think, was a great man.
Well, being a bachelor, Mike never needed a big house. So this was his house, and this was his basement, and he made it into a club. And that's the size it was, and it served the purpose because he never had big crowds here. He used to.
How would you describe what the concept was behind the Club Calumet?
I think the concept was where Mike could entertain his friends, because he had many, many friends. It was a place he could get people together in small groups to pump their brains and to sell some ideas he had in mind. It was a place they could fellowship, occasionally have a little small drink. I remember Art Crowley used to be the unofficial bartender. He was head of Consumer Power.
Oh, yes.
Usually found Art behind serving, but never any excess drinking, or just social drinking.
Well, that kind of gives you an idea that it was right here in the very setting that we're in tonight where the things happened that led to Flint's College and Cultural Center and the Institute of Arts, which is going to be featured in this particular segment.
What you have to understand about the FIA is that it's really the community's museum, because everything that's here has come here as a result of the generosity of the people of Flint and a few people outside Flint. And it's not any one person's pet project. It's been a community project from the very beginning. And our desire is that more and more of the community take advantage of what we have here. You can walk in our front door without paying a cent. Now, occasionally we will charge for a special program, but by and large, you know, the permanent collection galleries are always open free of charge. And we want more people to come and enjoy it. It's a very impressive collection. It spans the history of art from about the 14th century through the contemporary 20th century, with some very high quality works of art. Some of the earliest things in the collection, even earlier than the 1400s really, are in our Asian gallery. Chinese and Japanese works of art. Some of those go back to 2000 BC. For Western art, the earliest things are probably the objects housed in the Bray Gallery, which was the gift of Mrs. Viola Bray, who lived here in Flint, very generous woman, who bought a great set of 10 early 17th century French tapestries that had come on the market, that had once belonged to the Barberini family in Rome, and proceeded to provide a gallery to house them, designed specifically to show off the tapestries, and then added period furniture and ceramics and metalwork and all kinds of things to complement the tapestries. We go on then, we have a small collection. We need to do some work in building our collection of old master paintings. That is, say, from the 15th through the early 19th century. We only have a few things there, but what we have is very good. And then the collection becomes much stronger in the 19th century, especially with French Impressionist paintings, Post-Impressionist paintings, School of Paris paintings, and things in America that were being done at the same time in America are American paintings. Then we get into the 20th century, and the collection tends to explode with all kinds of contemporary works of art, sculpture and paintings and prints and decorative arts and all kinds of things. We have much more than we can show in the galleries at any one time. From the very beginning, the work of local artists has entered the collection, and it still does, because we feel it's important for us as Flint's Museum to document the history of the fine arts that are made in Flint by people living here. When the Institute was founded in
in the late 1920s, the schools seemed more important in relation to the collection or exhibits and things like that, simply because at that point the permanent collection consisted of only a handful of paintings and sculptures. Over the past more than 60 years, the collection has grown tremendously. Until now, it really spans a big part of the whole history of world art. And as the collection has grown, it has tended to become the focus of the FIA, more so than the school. However, today we are enrolling more students each year in the 4 semesters of classes that we offer than ever before in our history. This past year we had upwards of 2,000 students enrolled over the year's time. As long ago as only 3-4 years ago, the enrollment was barely half of that. So we think we're offering the community something the community finds valuable, and we're very encouraged at the way our school program is going. I should explain for people who aren't familiar with it, it's a non-degree granting art school for the community, classes for preschoolers through senior citizens in just about every art media that you can think of. Very high quality faculty. We try to offer all these courses at modest tuition costs, although as with everything else these days, costs tend to go up a little bit from time to time. So we think the school is very important. I'd like people who come here to visit the museum to go away with something they didn't have before they walked through the front door. Now that can be just a pleasurable experience. It can be some insight into art that they didn't have before, some deeper appreciation. If they come for a lecture, I would hope they would go away with a little bit more knowledge than they had before. I'd like the FIA to be looked upon not only as a pleasant place to visit, but a place where people can continue their education. Because in a very real sense, we are an educational institution. But the degree to which people benefit from that is determined by the decisions people make to walk through the front door. But it's all here waiting for the residents of Genesee County. It regularly is impressive to out-of-town visitors, and more so now since the renovation and everything is installed in such an impressive way. We've had any number of visitors come since we reopened our doors in June after the renovation, and I guarantee you they're impressed, and they let us know they're impressed, and they will say some things like, if they've been here before, for instance, one of the most common remarks is, "Wow, it really looks like a museum now." Or they'll say, if they haven't been here at all before, "I had no idea all this was here in Flint, Michigan." And I think it's good to hear those kinds of remarks these days when you hear so many derogatory remarks about Flint. I would be very happy if the city fathers, for instance, would take a more demonstrable pride in the Flint Institute of Art and the whole cultural center. The Cultural Center is a remarkable campus of institutions, the likes of which doesn't exist anywhere else in the United States. We're starting out in late September with a beautiful exhibition of American Impressionist paintings. That'll be followed by a very unusual show entitled "Oh Appalachia," which is a big exhibition of folk art from the southern mountain region of the United States. I think that's going to draw a great deal of interest. We'll be having then, early in the new year, a rather amazing exhibition of quilts that have been made by African-American women in the state of Michigan. It's rather a specialized kind of art creation, but really worth seeing. We'll also have, in conjunction with that, a rather large exhibition of vintage photographs taken during the 30s and 40s of the major jazz musicians of that age. And along with this, we'll have all kinds of programming and concerts and workshops and lectures and any number of things.
And those were exactly the things that the founding members could only hope would come to pass. Now, let's take a look at some other activities in and around Genesee County. Well, we're here at the Flint Institute of Arts, and we're talking with Sue Walters. Sue, I understand that you have some shows coming up on Impressionism. Tell us about it.
That's right. On Sunday, September 22nd, we'll have 3 openings. One, American Impressionism from the Sheldon Memorial Gallery in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is at the University of Nebraska. And along with that, we'll have the curator of that show giving a lecture at 2 p.m. in the auditorium, which is free to the public, and we invite everyone to come. Now, in conjunction with the American Impressionism show, we'll have Child Hossam, the printmaker, on exhibition in the Hodge Gallery, and so that one can compare the difference between American and French Impressionism, we'll have prints from the Albion College print collection.
That sounds exciting. And I understand that the classes that are going on right now that have already started, you can still register for these classes and call the Institute?
That's right. You can get a class schedule by calling the 234-1695, and a schedule will be sent to your home, and registration will continue for several weeks.
Sounds great, Sue. Well, thank you very much. And right now we're going to go over to the Sloan Museum. On the way, let me tell you about some things happening at Formar. We're here at the Sloan Museum with Nancy Cook, the education assistant. And Nancy, I understand you have some classes coming up this fall?
We do. We have a combination of science and history classes for children, and also a few for adults. And the classes are for kindergartners through 6th graders. They're offered on Saturdays, and they cover primarily interesting things about Michigan's history. And the science ones are done in a classroom in a lab where we do science experiments, and we have a good time.
And should people be registering for these classes now?
Yes, we would like you to pre-register for a class, and that can be done by calling the museum at 760-1169 anytime between 9 and 5 o'clock during the week, 12 to 5 on Saturdays and Sundays.
Sounds like a lot of fun, Nancy. I'm sure you'll get a lot of calls.
It is fun, and I enjoy it very much, and I enjoy the children, and I hope that will translate off to the kids.
Well, I'm John Kotarski. For all the crew here at Genesee Spotlights, have a great weekend. We'll see you again next Tuesday and Wednesday at 7 p.m. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write me here at Comcast. Until next time, make it a safe week.